Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to Retirement Income Intel for February. As everybody's coming in, always curious to know where you're joining us from. See who has the most exotic location here. I'm in Denver, Colorado. Not too exciting. Honolulu, Hawaii. You got a chance. The moon, pretty good. 100 degrees in Phoenix. Wow. Ooh, Cape Cod. Sounds nice, although I don't know how February in Cape Cod is. Palm Springs sounds nice. Terrible. We're actually getting a nice little reprieve in Colorado. We got a couple of 60-degree days here after a foot of snow, which is rapidly melting. So just some housekeeping while we wait for everybody to file in. This webinar is eligible for CE. So for CFP, please, well, first of all, make sure that you're on for at least 50 minutes. You know, with Zoom webinars, it tells us exactly how long you're on. So have to be on for 50 minutes to get credit. And please fill out the form at the end, which will ask you for your CFP ID. If you are in some kind of a self-report program for CE, and if you need any kind of certificate, we do typically have those available, at least for our ICP, maybe a few others. So just let us know with that, or just mark it down for self-report. I think that is it for housekeeping. So we'll just jump right in. So this presentation is an update of a presentation we've done a few times, but it's been actually a few years, and it's based on a concept that Derek Tharp and I introduced on the Kitsis blog. I think it was maybe even 2021. It's something we call the retirement distribution hatchet, and it's really a way of thinking about withdrawals in retirement that can help us understand and talk with clients, maybe most importantly, about withdrawals really as part of the overall picture of retirement income, and how we're going to fund our lifestyle in retirement in a way that I think hopefully we can help clients understand that something called a withdrawal rate is not really a thing, or it's not really a thing that they should focus on or believe that, going to their advisor, one of their goals is to figure out what their quote unquote withdrawal rate is. It's really far too of a way of approaching the question of how much to take from your portfolio. And anything we can do to kind of help clients understand that that's not a primary question of retirement, the better, because it'll help us move more toward how to really manage withdrawals and other pieces of the retirement picture in just a more realistic way. So the agenda for today, and by the way, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, just because that way we'll be able to more easily manage those at the end. We will leave time for questions at the end. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk a little bit about what withdrawal rates are. And I do want to start out by saying, I do understand where a focus on withdrawal rates comes from, both from clients and from advisors. It's not that this concept is completely useless. There is such thing as a withdrawal rate. But here's, they can be, it's a tempting topic for conversation, but for use in planning, they can be misleading and really less than useful in typical real life plans. And there's two ways where they're sometimes talked about as being useful, but the argument today will be that they're not. One is in helping someone figure out how much they can spend. If you've been on any of our webinars before, you know that a primary focus of Income Lab and our research and our software and so on is this concept that people, when they're retiring, they want to know, what can I spend? And it can be very tempting to think what they're asking is, what can I withdraw from my portfolio forever? We'll argue today that you really can't do that in most typical situations. The other place that people try to use withdrawal rates is in defining adjustment plans in retirement. And there's been a lot of work on withdrawal rate guardrails over the years, basically being able to say, often the argument is, oh, you could take more from your portfolio if you're willing to adjust, and you should track your withdrawal rate in order to make those adjustments. We'll argue here, and in the article that some of this is based on, we argue that that's not really a thing you can do. At least it won't lead to good results if you do try to do it. And instead, we really want to focus on more holistic measures of retirement risk, plan risk, that take the entire picture into account. And the concept that I've introduced in the past is thinking of retirement spending risk as overspending risk and underspending risk. So what are the chances that I'm living beyond my means? What are the chances I'm living too far below my means? And kind of understanding retirement risk in that way allows us to bring in everything about someone's situation, their life expectancy, fees, assumptions, inflation, the makeup of their plan, and so on, in a way that just focusing on withdrawal rates cannot do. So withdrawal rates, there seems to be a lot of promise to them because they're fairly simple. It's certain amounts of it is intuitive, but the argument here is, unfortunately, it just won't work. So again, why are withdrawal rates kind of a thing that you'll get questions from certain clients about? Why are they a thing in media stories, right? You'll consistently see articles about that. Sometimes these articles are oversimplifying the research, but they'll say things like, oh, the 4% rule is now the 3.7% rule, or the 4.5% rule or something. So there's a temptation to simplify retirement planning down to this concept of, oh, if we could just figure out what the withdrawal rate is, then everybody can just go live their life and just follow that rule of thumb, and it's easy. The bad news is, no, retirement planning is not that easy. It is not subject to rules of thumb. You can't apply it across the board. But the reason withdrawal rates are tempting is it seems like that's answering the question, how much can I afford to spend? Because if you think of the actual levers someone has in their retirement life, that seems like the biggest one. How much do I take out of my portfolio? That seems like, well, that's almost the only thing I can control. The fact is, most people have some other levers, things like when to file Social Security, maybe when to take a pension, or whether to take a lump sum. There tend to be actually many questions around retirement, many levers that you can pull. But this one seems to be the biggest. And so it does make sense that people focus on withdrawal rate. I think the other reason withdrawal rates are a hot topic for retirees is there is a basic question that safe withdrawal rate research, which started in the early 90s, has sought to answer, and I think has answered pretty well. That is a good question, which is just, okay, given the way the world works, given that there are, people get varying returns, what can someone reasonably take from a portfolio and continue to do so over time? So that's where things like the 4% rule came from, the Trinity study. I've just referenced, I know Morningstar consistently puts out new articles on kind of, okay, well, what's the safe withdrawal rate now? Their research is actually a little more subtle than that, but often it gets blurbed as, oh, now there's a new rule. So I'm not saying in this webinar that this is all pointless and useless. Far from it. I actually think that research is foundational in the sense that it helped people understand the importance of things like sequence of return risk, and really understand, in living in the real world where returns vary up and down, what is kind of a range of things that someone can take from their portfolio. For those of you who don't know, probably aren't many, but withdrawal rates are just what am I withdrawing from my portfolio divided by the balance of my portfolio, right? So here's some examples. In this case, if you're taking $40,000 a year from $1 million portfolio, that's 4% withdrawal rate. If the balance went up, your withdrawal rate goes down unless you take more money. If your balance goes down, your withdrawal rate goes up. So that's the examples here. So as I said, the focus on withdrawal rates is not totally pointless. That my argument here is not that we should just get rid of the term or something. It has had some good effects, including helping people understand sequence of returns. That's probably the biggest one, because in the absence of this kind of research, people typically just looked at sort of time value of money calculations, present value or payment calculations on a calculator or in Excel. Those are not useless either, but there's a real effect of sequence of returns that's highlighted in this kind of research. It also, I think, has helped people understand that there are factors that affect reasonable withdrawal rates. Things like the 4% rule get all the headlines, but really, in that research and all the other research in this area, people have focused on things like fees, returns, allocation, volatility, all these things having an effect, length of plan, having an effect on what a quote unquote safe withdrawal rate would be in kind of this laboratory environment where all we're focusing on is how much you can take out of your portfolio. So that's the good. The bad is two things, which you saw on the agenda. One is withdrawal rates don't answer the question, what can I spend, for most people. And the other is withdrawal rates are not good at providing guardrails or plans for adjustment over time. So we'll start with withdrawal rates don't answer the question, what can I spend? So typically withdrawal rate research, and if you have a client who comes to you and asks, well, what can I take from my portfolio? They will often mean if my plan looked like this. Straight line, flat, take the same amount every year, every month, forever, typically adjusted for inflation is what they mean. So in this graph, we'd be looking at real dollars, today's dollars. They're asking, well, what can I take? Keep taking that amount out forever. We can already see why this is not very realistic for really most people, probably close to all people. One is it assumes steady inflation-adjusted withdrawals. That is not typically how people will need to take money from their portfolio. And we'll go into reasons why. It's excluding any other income sources. So it's sort of this idea that well, if I have other income sources, those will just add to this amount, rather than kind of viewing how to use your resources as a way of sort of building a layer cake of different resources, whether that's Social Security, pensions, maybe you have a rental property, maybe you're selling a business. Layering all those into one picture. The withdrawal rate concept really extracts all that away and just says, no, I just want to focus on withdrawal rates. I'm just going to pretend I have nothing else in my life. What can I take and take the same amount for the rest of my life? We won't talk a lot about this today, but it's seldom discussed. These concepts are always involve no taxes. So there's a couple ways to look at that. You could think of they're saying, well, all of your money is in a Roth, or more realistically, it's really, well, the taxes will be what they are, but what can I withdraw? Now, the fact is, the large amount of people's portfolios that's in IRAs, 401ks, and so on, that's fair because systematic withdrawals from an IRA do not care what your tax rate is. And so when people talk about withdrawal rates and safe withdrawal rates, they're talking about gross of tax numbers. Like I said, we're not going to dive deep into that today, but just worth noting that there's no tax in withdrawal rate conversations. And finally, and we'll spend a lot of time on this today, there's an assumption that there won't be any adjustments in behavior for good or bad performance or living through good or bad periods, high or low inflation, and so on. So that's what's behind withdrawal rates. And you can already see why, okay, this is, maybe it's useful as a research topic, but it's really not useful in building a real plan. So for example, here I have just a example plan that layers in lots of different resources. So we have a pension, we have some part-time work, we have 2 different Social Securities phased over different periods of time. We're looking at this in today's dollars, so you're not seeing inflation in here, although the plan itself has inflation, but we've just stripped out inflation in this picture. And we have a plan to spend using what at Income Lab we call an age-based pattern, meaning you spend more when you're younger, less when you're older, and then it comes back up at the end, or more commonly, you'll see it called the retirement smile, which is just the concept that people spend more earlier in retirement when they're young, healthy, active. Maybe it's when they've just stopped working, and so there's sort of this this period of more frenetic pace of life, kind of the honeymoon period, the vacation period, and then as people maybe slow down, maybe they have health effects, they just spend less over time. So this is just a basic hypothetical household, but you can see the dark blue color here is their portfolio withdrawals. And here the portfolio withdrawals are layered in on top of this, layer cake of other sources of resources, sources of spending. And you can see this is a typical shape for people who are delaying Social Security. So here, we're delaying it, 4 or 5 years. And what we see is this dark blue shape kind of looks like a hatchet. So that's why Derek Tharp and I call this the retirement distribution hatchet. So it's not a negative thing, right? It's just the shape of your withdrawals is initially it's front loaded. And so you're filling in this gap before you take Social Security with portfolio withdrawals. And the fact is, this could look like extremely high withdrawals early on. And if you just focused on the number, at the beginning of the plan, you might say, wait a second, we're taking 5, 6, 7, 8% of our portfolio. Surely that's not okay. That's going to be unsafe. But you can see, well, you have to step back and say, well, no, our plan over the life of the plan is to fill in the gaps with portfolio withdrawals. And sometimes that'll be a lot, sometimes that'll be very little. And we have to look at the whole thing in order to understand how much you can afford to withdraw at any one time. But there is no number that we would want to focus on to say, oh, now it's too much or too little, right? I wouldn't want to say, well, anything over 4% is bad, anything under 4% is too little. Let's always do 4%. That wouldn't be the kind of plan most people would want. People are looking to roughly smooth out their spending while also hitting particular goals. Like I said, maybe they have a plan to travel more when they're young and so on. But people we don't want to be sort of subject to when non-portfolio income streams come and go. You don't want to say, well, I'm just going to have to spend a lot less until Social Security kicks in. No, the plan is, we can spend this roughly the same amount now, and just in the future, Social Security will take over for some of the portfolio withdrawals. So this is why it's called the hatchet. In fact, with the smile there, you even have a nice ergonomic handle on the withdrawal shape. One way to think about this, if you're describing it to a client, is portfolio withdrawals are kind of like water in a swimming pool. So we'll build the base of your swimming pool with things like Social Security and any other income sources. And then sort of the length of the swimming pool will be, the length of your plan. And then we're just going to pour water in on the top. And there will be parts where the water is deeper, parts where the water is shallower. And in this case, given gravity, it'll just be flat on the top. The fact is, in particular plans, it may not be flat on the top. You may have, waves in it or so on. But just stepping back from those particulars of things like the smile or of, paying for a wedding or funding grandkids' educations, it's roughly like we're filling in a swimming pool. And so there will be parts that are deeper, parts that are shallower. If we're able to make the swimming pool shallower in general, because we have, say, more Social Security, maybe the overall water level will rise, and that's the ability to spend more. So this is a decent metaphor for how portfolio withdrawals really work, and it can help people understand that no, there's not this. Very few people's swimming pool bottoms are, the same depth the whole way across. So going back to that example we just saw, here we have at the beginning, and I believe this was a $1 million portfolio in this example. We're taking $67,000 a year at first. That goes down to $55,000, $24,000, and even all the way down to $10,500. 20 years from now. And so you can see that there's not really a withdrawal. We could divide these numbers by the current balance and get a quote unquote withdrawal rate, but it's not really a very useful thing to do. Partly because of what I've just gone over, and that we're going to take different amounts at different times. The other reason is we don't know what the portfolio balance will be in the future. And so dividing it by today's portfolio balance is sort of silly. Should I be dividing 10,500, which is what I plan to spend 20 years from now, by today's balance? Doesn't seem like a very useful thing to do. So why don't withdrawal rates answer the question, what can I spend? Which is one of the key questions clients have. It's because for most plans, there's no single withdrawal rate, quote unquote, that applies throughout the plan. And so you can't follow just sort of simple systematic withdrawal plans. If you build a plan holistically with all resources that people have access to, withdrawals are an important part, but we're not building a plan by deciding the withdrawal rate. We're deciding how much to take at each point in time, and those amounts could vary quite a bit. In plans that have lumpy, irregular, or changing spending needs, so for example, a really common one is people retire and they still have a mortgage. So they need to spend more now to pay the mortgage, and then when the mortgage is gone, they'll spend less because they don't have to pay the mortgage. So any kind of lumpy or irregular things make it really not possible to target a particular withdrawal rate rule of thumb. For all the reasons we've just gone over, withdrawal rates as a focus for knowing when you're spending too much or too little and giving people advice on how much they can spend also don't really work because of the complexity of even just normal people's lives. Just as soon as you add a couple of Social Securities, some timing, maybe a retirement smile, you're out of the world where you could even reasonably apply withdrawal rate guardrails to a plan. There are other reasons that they won't work as well, but it becomes cumbersome and just even in itself not possible. So that's what we'll turn to now, which is this last assumption around withdrawal rates, which is that you're not going to make adjustments for good or bad performance. Again, I'll say, if you actually read the research on withdrawal rates, 4% rule, Trinity study, and so on, those authors are actually not saying that you would never adjust. Those things, those comments, though, are typically kind of ignored. So I think people have been aware that there's a need to be dynamic and take changes in the environment around you into account for a long time. So it was natural, I think, given the popularity of talk about withdrawal rates in the 90s and early 2000s, for people to say, oh, well, this is great, but we do need adjustment plans too. Let's just use withdrawal rates to do it. Unfortunately, they don't work. So let's look at a typical kind of withdrawal rate guardrail example. So the concept of a guardrail is saying, hey, we have a plan, we're gonna spend a certain amount, but we'll set guardrails. And that means we can let clients know, hey, if things get really bad to the point where we hit this guardrail, we'll spend less. If they get much better to the point where we hit this guardrail, we'll spend more. So it's really a way of helping people avoid overspending and avoid underspending. And so far, so good. That's a great goal to have. And there are many examples of how people have tried to do guardrails and adjustment-based spending in the past. I'm just focusing today on the withdrawal rate examples. Similar problems arise with other approaches to guardrails and adjustments. And I'd say one of the biggest is just that in trying to be very simple and easy to calculate or apply, they become they can lead to a plan that will do the wrong thing at the wrong time. And the reason is basically because a lot of these are totally arbitrary, and they don't recognize, the complexity of real people's lives and how plans change over time. So for example, this would be a typical withdrawal rate guardrail set of rules, which would say, let's begin taking 5% from our portfolio, and we're not going to refigure that amount. We're just going to keep spending that until we hit a guardrail. What are the guardrails? Well, you might say, well, if the withdrawal rate goes down to 3% or lower, we will get a pay raise. In this case, we will just revert back to the original 5%. Again, there are lots of versions of this. Many of them would say something like, reduce spending by 10% or things like that, right? But we're just doing a very simple one here. On the other hand, if the withdrawal rate goes up to 6%, then we'll reduce spending. Again, we'll just go back to 5%. So in this example, our $1 million goes to 1.7, which makes, if we're taking $50,000 out of a $1.7 million portfolio, that's a 2.9% withdrawal rate. That's too low, right? And so we're in danger now of underspending our resources. We've talked a lot about when people underspend their resources because they're worried. We talk about it as there's a risk of regret, right? So this is something, maybe they're giving up on experiences with loved ones, or maybe they're charitably inclined and they really could have done a lot of good in their, with that money, but they're not using it. And so they may find themselves, in their 80s or 90s wishing they had spent it, right? So this is sort of we hit the, avoid regret guardrail here, and we're going to spend more, 85,000, which is 5% of the 1.7 million. On the other hand, if that million went down to 820,000, our withdrawal rate, again, 50,000 divided by 820, is now 6.1. That's above 6. So we're going to reduce spending down to 5% of our original portfolio. Or sorry, of the current portfolio. What are the benefits of these kind of withdrawal rate guardrails? Well, there are some. Unfortunately, they're not worth it. One is they're really easy to manage, right? The math is super simple. Just take what you're withdrawing, divide it by the balance. That's your withdrawal rate. There is an intuitive link to risk, so even clients can kind of get it. Yeah, right. I don't want to take too much out of my portfolio. I want to take the right amount out. And so if I'm running too hot, I need to take less. If I'm running too cold, I can take more. So there is an intuitive link to risk. And there's been a lot of research on it. So a lot of people have written about it. The problem is this way of stating withdrawal rate guardrails as, okay, our guardrail is 3% and 6%, or whatever it is. As I said, often it's slightly more complex than that, but not much more complex. That's attractive because it's so simple. You can tell it to a client. The problem is it works really terribly if you actually stress test it in real historical scenarios. The reasons for that is it's this kind of approach to withdrawal rate guardrails is not recognizing a ton of things about a normal plan, including the ones we just went over regarding the retirement distribution hatchet. So it doesn't account for realistic spending patterns like the retirement smile. It doesn't account for non-portfolio income like Social Security. It also doesn't account for the fact that different withdrawal rates are good or bad depending on the situation. Do you have a long life or a short life? High fees, high inflation, low inflation. None of that is actually taken into account with withdrawal rate guardrails because they're really just too simple. They're trying to pretend we're in a world where no one ages, plan lengths are always the same, no one has outside income, it's all from the portfolio, no one spends more or less at different times in their life, and so on. And so they just fail, in many cases pretty miserably, if you're trying to follow them through time with a real plan. Let's focus on that last piece, which is how things change with age. So depending on someone's age and their, how long they think they might live, are they sort of maybe they have a lot of people who live a really long time in their family, so their genes sort of say, well, maybe we should live a little longer, or maybe it's the reverse. But also just based on your age, depending on how long your plan is, different withdrawal rates will make sense. Even if you live in a world where there's no Social Security, no pensions, no retirement smile, even in that world, withdrawal rate guardrails don't work. And so here what I have is, if we just take, we're just using actuarial tables from the Society of Actuaries. We have a 65-year-old male-female couple. And as they age, we're looking at the quote-unquote success rates. Those of you who've been on some of our webinars in the past know we really don't like talking in probability of success terms with clients. I'm doing it today because it is a common way that people think about these things in the safe withdrawal rate literature. But as I go through time, as I get older, the amount I can withdraw and at the same success rate goes up. That just makes sense, right? If I'm funding a 10-year retirement, I can take a lot more than if I'm funding a 30-year retirement. And that is not recognized in withdrawal rate guardrail situations. So, here's how, even if I keep my kind of survivorship risk the same, or my longevity risk the same rather, and just look through time, my plan length will go down. Well, what if I try to apply those guardrails that we just talked about, where if I'm taking too much, I reduce my withdrawals. If I'm taking too little, I increase my withdrawals. Well, that 6% guardrail, as we can see here, as people age, very quickly, they will naturally, if we just kept their risk identical, they would quickly be able to take more than 6% without increasing their risk. And yet by having a static guardrail, we're just saying, no, as soon as you're in that phase, that's actually super risky and you should reduce your spending. No, in fact, it may be that you should increase your spending in these phases. So having a static withdrawal rate guardrail is just it's just ludicrous if you just take into account that people's plan length goes down over time. And there are lots of things that change whether a withdrawal rate is risky or not risky. So I just used 65 male female. If you're single, you have probably a shorter plan because your joint life expectancy is shorter because you don't have a joint. Male am like all of that matters. Your mortality risk tolerance, again, thinking about like, well, am I really healthy? Should I reasonably expect a long life? All of that goes into figuring out if a withdrawal rate is particularly high or particularly low, particularly risky or not. Also, asset allocation, capital market assumptions, fees and expenses, all of this goes into just figuring out whether a particular withdrawal rate at a particular time is risky or not. Forget about for a second the fact that actually over time they change. So here's just an example of single versus joint and how withdrawal rates go up if you're single. The second risk, or the second challenge with using withdrawal rates for guardrails, is that if you have any kind of plan with varying spending needs, it's not going to work. So the retirement smile is a good example. Someone paying off a mortgage still is a good example. Someone who is funding grandkids' education or taking extra vacations for a while. Those are all great examples. And the reason is, if you're planning on taking different amounts out at different points in time, it becomes very hard to know whether a withdrawal rate is high or low because you were planning on doing it that way, or because circumstances have changed and made your risk too high or too low. So for example, here, let's say we're planning on taking $174,000 a year at the beginning of the plan. And then in today's dollars, 10 years later, you were planning on taking $150,000. And then over time, you actually do this, and your balance 10 years from now goes from 3 million to 3.8 million. Okay, so we're taking less money out because that's what we originally planned. Our balance happens to be higher, and our withdrawal rate is now 3.9%. If I had a withdrawal rate guardrail that said, if my withdrawal rate goes below 4%, increase it. So I've switched the example here a little bit. So before it was 3%, now it's 4%. That's our guardrail. Should I increase my spending at this point? I don't know. Maybe because our balance is higher, but also our withdrawal rate, quote unquote, is lower, but we intended it to be lower at this point. So it's just not at all clear what am I supposed to do here? And that's very typical. And by the way, that picture was only portfolio withdrawals. So that even assumes that you were only focusing on portfolio withdrawals. In a more realistic plan, the portfolio withdrawals might have gone down quite a bit more because now you're replacing some of them with Social Security. And again, the question will simply be, well, hang on, did my withdrawal rate go down the normal amount I would have wanted it to, or is it down enough that I should take a pay raise? It's just not at all clear. And there's really no saving withdrawal rates from this fate of being just way too kind of simple a tool to use in real life plan for most people. So what's an alternative? In trying to figure out the two things we're focusing on today, one, how much can I spend, right? We spent the first part of this webinar talking about how people think that withdrawal rates are a great way to address the question, what can I spend? But that in real life, portfolio withdrawals kind of serve as this water that you pour in over the base that you've built of other income sources. And the second thing, figuring out when to make adjustments over time, we argued that withdrawal rates don't work well in setting up guardrails. So what's an alternative? The alternative is thinking about at each point in time whether someone is at risk of overspending their resources or underspending their resources. And one kind of intuitive way of getting to that understanding of risk is, okay, well, what are people after in retirement? If they go to a financial advisor asking how much can I spend, what they're really asking is, hey, I want to live the best life I can. I want to deploy my resources in the best way possible to accomplish my goals, live a good life, spend time with family and friends, whatever it is that my goals are. I want to do the best I can, given the resources I have, the time I'm given, and the world I happen to live through. So given the resources I have means, look, if I was a school teacher, I'm not going to be flying private jets. I get it. I'm not asking for miracles here, but I want to deploy my resources as smartly as possible. I don't want to underspend and regret. I don't want to overspend and have anxiety and regret. Given the time I'm given, right? So tomorrow's not guaranteed, but maybe we have some expectations of how long I'll live. So let's be prudent about spreading those resources out over time. And the world I happen to live through, meaning help me navigate. I don't have any control over whether there's high or low inflation, but I do have control over how I react to those things. So help me navigate those. In other words, at each point in time, I don't want to overspend and I don't want to underspend. So this would be very typical set of goals for a retiree. There are people who have so much in resources, they're never really worried about underspending because they just have already recognized that they'll never spend all their resources. For those people, though, there's still lots to do in terms of helping them sort of leave the legacy they want. Maybe it's leaving a living legacy. Maybe it's spending time instead of money. Maybe it's, thoughtfully leaving a legacy instead of letting your executor do it. So there's still plenty to do in the don't underspend side. And then for most people, what they think most about is first, I don't want to overspend. And this is, partly just a natural risk aversion, loss aversion that we have as humans, right? We feel loss more than we feel the same amount of gain, right? So this is the goal here. And I think it's helpful to think of giving retirement spending advice, in a way that's similar to how we give portfolio allocation, asset allocation advice, in that this is simply a risk reward balance, and different people will have a different optimal balance for risk and reward. But very few people, when they go to an advisor for advice on investing, will get the advice to invest as safely as possible, and maybe a 100% tips portfolio or something like that. In fact, advisors more often talk about how they have to help clients, maybe get money out of CDs and into some investments that can have a higher return, and so on. And it's very unlikely that you're going to suggest that somebody is 100% crypto or something. They probably have a balance. Well, the same is true for spending. There is sort of a lowest spending level that you can imagine. There's a highest spending level that you can imagine. Most people are probably going to be in between. Most people will target spending that is within their means, so what we call the underspending zone, but they don't want to be too deeply into it, right? Then they probably don't want to be, you certainly don't want to start in the overspending zone. And if over time, because of changes in the environment, because of changes in portfolio balance, inflation, and so on, if that spending level starts to look like overspending, that's when you would suggest a change in the plan, a change in spending to reel in the risk and return them to a place where they're spending within their means. The kinds of things that can lead to a higher risk of overspending is lower than expected returns. Hey, we thought this would be the experience we get. Things aren't looking good, right? Higher than expected inflation, higher than expected spending, right? People have unexpected needs, and they have to address the urgent need right now and just take the consequences for the future. Or maybe it's even changes in your own assumptions about how the future could look. All of that can lead that spending level to look more and more like overspending and lead to the need to hit a guardrail and make an adjustment. Things that can lead to a higher risk of underspending, which is that risk of regret, right? That we're not using our resources optimally. Higher than expected returns, lower than expected inflation, lower than expected spending, right? Hey, we thought we'd do this, we didn't for whatever reason. COVID's a great example of that. Lots of people canceled vacations and things, right? You just spent less, you couldn't spend if you wanted to. Maybe it's you've changed your assumptions. Hey, we actually think maybe there will be higher returns in the future, or we think there'll be lower inflation. Anything can happen, right? And importantly, we talked about this toward the middle of this webinar, the plan itself getting shorter increases the risk of underspending. So just over time, you saw those curves, right, of what a withdrawal rate at a certain risk level would be. They go up, right? So just all else being equal, if your plan gets shorter, your risk of underspending goes up, and you are essentially getting permission to spend more. Again, that's all else being equal. So for example, if the portfolio balance remained the same. So these are how underspending and overspending change over time. And what happens, in this more realistic world where overspending and underspending it's a holistic picture. It's everything related to your plan. It's everything related to your assumptions. It's not just portfolio withdrawals. For example, if you have a large pension that's not adjusted for inflation, well, inflation experience is going to have a big effect on whether you're more likely to be overspending or underspending as time goes on, right? So if inflation comes in low, great, that pension is worth more to you. If it comes in high, we're going to have to supplement it with more portfolio withdrawals, and so your risk of overspending is going up. So we need the whole thing to be taken into account, not just withdrawals. And then as we track this over time, our guardrails change. And this is maybe the easiest way to describe why withdrawal rate guardrails don't work is they're not changing, right? You can't apply a 6% guardrail at 60 and also apply that same guardrail at 80. That just doesn't make any sense. You're older, plan is shorter, you probably have a different amount in your portfolio. There's just all sorts of things that are different. Same way you can't apply a 3% guardrail at each point in time. So the guardrails you see here are from the Income Lab's retirement stress test, which allows you to run any plan through a particular sequence of returns and inflation and see how these guardrails and adjustments would adjust over time. And basically, if your guardrails aren't changing, there's a problem, right? Because as the environment changes, the guardrails should change. As you age, the guardrails should change, and so on. So static guardrails are not a good tool to use for helping people know what to spend in retirement. So we've written a lot of articles on these topics before, so I wanted to draw your attention. We'll send out the PDF for this presentation, and these are links, so you can just link directly to these articles on kitces.com. The original article was the Retirement Distribution Hatchet. Derek and I had another article specifically looking at a particular version of withdrawal rate guardrails, the Guyton-Klinger guardrails, last year. And then also this concept of overspending and underspending, and why that is a good way to talk with clients, and how to figure out these two main questions of how much can I spend and should I adjust my spending, why that's a really good framework for that. That was also last year. So please have a look at those. And so with that, I believe that's the end, and we can start taking some questions. Okay, so, and yeah, feel free to click the little up thumbs up button if there are ones that you want to make sure that we address. Okay. So this is a good question of how would you address the withdrawal rate or the spending before Social Security when the rate is high for a couple of years. So I assume the question here is really, if a client comes in thinking to themselves, maybe they're anchored to 4%, or, like I said, there's lots of articles about this where people are always kind of trying to say, oh, now it's 3.5, or now it's 4.5, or, always trying to, I think that the intention is good with these articles, but when people try to take them into their own life and say, oh, therefore that's the rule I should follow, that's where the problem comes in. I have found that this graph is one of the most useful ones for describing this to clients. So if they're worried that, let's say this is $1 million portfolio and they're taking what looks like 6.7% withdrawals, and they come into you and they say, that's crazy. What are you doing? I heard it's 4, or I heard it's 3.5. Just looking at this graph, you say, well, I understand that that's what the research says for someone who has the only resources they have is their portfolio, but that's not you. You have Social Security as well. And we've decided, let's assume you have figured that this is a good choice. We've decided to delay Social Security. Maybe it's till 70, because we think that's worth more to you. We can't get an 8% increase in other things guaranteed, right? There's some reason that you've decided to postpone Social Security. And so what we need to do is, we're not going to sort of have you live more frugally in the meantime, and then when Social Security starts now allow you to spend. Let's just let you live your life. And in order to do that, we have to pour the withdrawals in to make up the gap. But don't worry, that same article you read about 4%, I'm sure it would say that taking 2.4% is far too low, right? So what we're doing is we're giving you a customized plan that fits your actual situation. That 4% rule article, that's very generic, rules of thumb, applies to almost no one. Like that, essentially, if you really could follow a 4% rule, you don't need me, right, as your advisor. You do, however, need an advisor to figure out this more complex phasing of withdrawals. So I think this is, from what I've heard from advisors, this graph is hugely helpful. It may be, if I don't know if this, if the water metaphor will help you, but you might also try that one. All right. So yeah, we will send out the slide deck, by the way. By the way, what I was calling age-based, or the retirement smile, which is this kind of wavy structure, that also is sometimes called the go-go, slow-go, and no-go years. So go-go years being spending more, young, healthy, energetic. Slow-go really meaning more like we're slowing down a bit from that peak, and then no-go being, end of life type areas. So what is really nice about this kind of planning, whatever you call it, is what we have. Let's see here, right here. which is planning in this way, which really just recognizes how people just will plan, will spend whether they had planned to or not, right? In a way, you're basically recognizing that you just won't be able to spend as much when you're older, other than, potential medical issues, but those can be, well, they're slightly taken into account here, but you can also just include an end of life, maybe long-term care plan and things like that. It's just recognizing that that's probably how you'll spend anyway. And so by not planning to spend more when you won't, you can spend more when you can. And here, just applying the retirement smile increases the current spending, the early in retirement spending, by about 18%, which is massive. I mean, that's 18% more spending is really a huge amount. So that's my thoughts on go, slow go, no go, or retirement smile spending. Planning. I do know Derek Tharp's not here today, unfortunately, but he does recommend, if you have a client where, if I look at, if I built a plan like this, for example, and I'm able to take, $7,000 a month between my pension, part-time work, withdrawals, and so on. And if that's way more than they're currently spending, you can actually plan for flat spending, even though that probably isn't what they'll do. And then that's essentially giving them an even more conservative plan. It provides them more of a buffer for bad times and so on. So I think there is still a role for planning for flat inflation-adjusted spending for those households who seem to have a surplus of resources compared to the lifestyle that they actually want to live. So we typically, like income lab plans, for example, default to asking the question, what can I spend? And they're not asking how much do you want to spend? They're asking, what can I spend given my resources? If that answer is much higher than someone wants, then you can start playing around with it and sort of saying, well, maybe in fact you'll spend, following the smile or the age-based pattern, but we'll build a plan. It looks a little more conservative, and then we'll reap that dividend. In the future, if things turn out pretty well, then we'll just be giving people a lot of advice to say, like, hey, you could spend more, you could gift, you could go on vacation with your family, you could, do all these things, which is those are nice conversations to have. Okay. Okay, so is there a quick way to compare the 4% rule versus risk-based guardrails? That's a really good question, and has Income Lab considered like a feature to do this? I believe there is a way to do this. It's not, like push a button, boom, we do it for you. But you can essentially turn off guardrails in Income Lab plans. Almost no one does it because there's not really a good reason to, but you can turn them off and build a plan that will just spend, you'll have to kind of tinker with it to get it to be about 4%, but you can do it. And just have them spend that amount, no guardrails, and then you'll see in either the retirement stress test or in plan test, you'll see the plan either just run out of money in the few cases where that would be too much, or just have a ton of money left at the end, and that's where you start talking about regret and what is retirement? What are your goals in retirement? What is this for? What is living a good life in financial terms, right? And helping people understand that there's not just overspending risk, there's underspending risk. And it would be very easy if the only thing you wanted from your advisor was advice on how not to overspend. I mean, it's super simple. I just tell you to spend very little, spend as little as possible. But that's not good advice, right? That's not optimizing my life. So I think if you remove the guardrails, you will get lots of examples of, wow, look at this. Yeah, you kept spending, $40,000 a year, but in the vast majority of cases, you end up with, $10 million when you die. Well, that either means you spent a lot less than you would have, or you worked way longer than you would have had to, right? You could have just retired earlier. So there's all sorts of sources in Income Lab of showing that regret. And then in some cases, you'll also see that, no, it would have been nice to have that lower guardrail too, to keep you in shape and help you sort of make temporary small adjustments over time. So it's a good idea, and I can take it to our product team about like, wouldn't it be nice just to do sort of a, for this family, build you a 4% rule plan, just so you have it there to compare. I do think that's a good idea. You can create one manually, and maybe we can create a knowledge base article or a video on how to do it. That one had a lot of upvotes. All right. Just have about 5 minutes left. And look for ones with upvotes. Okay, so does stress testing in Income Lab incorporate the same Hatchet withdrawals in the normal projection? In other words, is the system accounting for where the withdrawals are coming from? Yes, absolutely. So in a stress test, like the example that I was showing at the end here, which is this is through the global financial crisis. The balance here, I'm just showing balance and guardrails, but I could have showed you the income as well. That the income that it's showing here is a mixture of whatever was in the plan at that point in time. So if it's largely Social Security, the guardrails will tend to be quite wide. If it's largely withdrawals at that point, they might be tighter. This is all exactly stress testing that exact plan. So it's not some kind of generic plan that it's stress testing. It's the actual plan that you're working on. So you will see the effect of the Hatchet, for example. So one thing that is actually nice about the way that Income Lab does this is sometimes things like delaying Social Security can look like it's free money. And for a lot of people, it is the right decision to delay Social Security till 70, but it's not, there's no free lunch. And so what you'll see in Income Lab is if I delay Social Security, I create a bigger Hatchet blade, which means I'm stressing my portfolio more, which means I have higher sequence of return risk. And so my guardrails will be tighter, especially the lower guardrail. Often not enough to make a difference. It might still be fine, but if you're looking at software in something as complex as retirement planning, and it looks like, oh, you can do something and it's just free money, and somewhere the cost is hidden, right? And so the cost of delaying Social Security is your lower guardrails closer because you have higher sequence of return risk. Again, could be a totally good decision to make, but that's the cost. And there are people where they don't have enough in their portfolio to take that risk, and so they'll take Social Security sooner to limit that risk because they really can't afford to live through a really bad sequence of returns if they only have, $100,000 or something. So yeah, it's absolutely taken into account in the software. All right, I think we probably have time for about one more. And yes, we'll send out the recording after this as well. Somebody did ask whether you could just maintain the same probability of success if you were using probability of success planning. Let me see here. And I would say that if you test that, the results are not particularly good. You could do it, yes. But what you would end up doing is, let's say if you kept the probability of success to say 90 or 80, which that's kind of a range that most people are comfortable starting their plans in. It's not in this slide deck, but we've done a few presentations, and the masterclass series that we've done, we've always talked about this. Probability of success, I know it's a term that we use a lot. I have a lot of problems with the term itself. One of them is it is misleading because it's not a probability of success in the sense of success meaning living the best life I can, which is what people think success means. It really means chance of underspending. That, like, mathematically, that's what it means. And so if you're sticking to a 90% probability of success, you're sticking to a 90% probability of underspending. In other words, it's almost certain you're going to be underspending, probably by a lot, and leaving a ton behind that you didn't intend to. So this is one reason why switching to overspending, underspending is like, it's just helpful in clarifying, because it makes it clear, oh, actually the ideal place to be is right on the bubble, right? I'm neither underspending nor overspending. In practice, we don't do that. We typically, we set people up to be underspending, and then that gives us a nice buffer, so we don't have to make any adjustments for a while. But by having these guardrails that are not so tight, you kind of allow things to move around a little bit. We don't get whipsawed. We don't, reduce spending, then increase spending, then reduce it again, and so on. So we kind of live within this comfort zone range. So just in testing, it just turns out people are closer to living kind of an optimized lifestyle if you don't try to stick to a particular probability of success. And the main reason is if you do that, you will basically guarantee underspending. All right, so that's all the time we have for today. I know we have some other questions. We'll take a look at those and get back to you if we're able to do that. And you'll also get this recording and the slides in the next day or two. And please remember to fill out your CFP number after this. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you again soon.